Hello, everyone. It's been a little while since I've recorded, over a week, missed a week. I enjoy them very much. But last Saturday, the Saturday before, we were at my fifth granddaughter wedding. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment because it leads into the concern I have for the young today and what they face. But first of all, as usual, a little bit more of the Sermon on the Mount. We have looked at what the Beatitudes are, that they are, in fact, Christ saying to us, I want you to have more than mere conversion. I want you to become a disciple, because that is the best life you can have. And the way you get there is not by holding your hands in the air entirely. That's part of it, of course, in a sense. But it's by developing a disciplined life. And what the Beatitudes are is a daily discipline. Face the truth about your screw-ups in the last 10 minutes too, or certainly 24 hours. Confess. Be set free in order to go on again. That happens too. Now, recognize that Christ doesn't need us. We need Christ. He could do it all on his own, but he chooses to give us, as Pascal puts it, the dignity of causality. And as that becomes the way you live, with the wonderful metaphor of Christ as the rider and us as the horse now ready for battle, then you look around for what you're supposed to do, and that pops up in various ways. And you become much more merciful because you receive so much mercy yourself. And that working through will give you vision, which ultimately is the vision of God himself, the beatific vision. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God in a way that is mind-blowing and heart-stopping. That leads to a character which is conducive to creating peace. And finally, ever realistic, our Lord says, and you will not be praised for it, but it's a blessing. And he really turns our world upside down when he points out that the way you deal with persecution is not by getting emotional, but by realizing this is where our Lord went before us. So we should be honored to be allowed to go in that direction. That's the way the early church saw it. Martyrdom created the church. The sword created Islam. It's the difference. And the early church flourished despite being killed in their thousands for their faith. We're not worthy to lick their bootstraps. And Jesus says, what this all does is prepare you to be salt and light in the world. Where the church is alive, it is salt in the world. The amazing 18th century revival and the abolition of slavery are very closely linked. It's just that the secular world doesn't want to acknowledge what is obvious to anybody with any historical insight. That's the way it worked. Didn't happen anywhere else in the same way. So, salt and light is what we're supposed to be, and we're happier with I think the light bit, we think by having happy meetings on Sunday, we're showing the light to the world. But I think that's the word I want. It's an inadequate account of what the gospel does. And we always want to be in charge of the way it's done. And every now and again, we are shown that we got it wrong, or we didn't pay enough attention. I mean, a lot of missionaries have spent a lot of time in Muslim countries for very little reward, but they were preparing the ground whether they knew it or not. And now the internet, amazingly, is taking apart the Islamic world, because up until this point, the local imam controlled the narrative. But now people turn on their phones around the world and they see, oh, our way of life is not the only one. And for the Muslim, the biggest problem that now hits them straight between the eyes is we have been taught that we are the final revelation and that we will rule the world. Well, it doesn't look like it to me. And it doesn't look like it to people in places like Iran, where they're basically saying, no, we've had 13 centuries and we haven't achieved anything. We don't make anything that people want. Oil is dug out of the ground by other people and we sell it and we're rich because of it. And it's not a good move. So Islam is really on the skids if it can't deal with this, and it can't. So that world has all changed. And we're sitting watching what's happening. We're in a period of great flux. So what does the next bit of the Sermon on the Mount do? Well, once you've got those first 12 verses sorted out in your mind, the rest follows. And the rest of chapter 5 is an inversion of the way we think about law. Think about that. Jesus is turning the Jewish world upside down. And our world in many ways. We still need this. He says, in effect, you have misunderstood the law. The law is not a way to God. Keeping the law is not going to get you close to God because you're a fallen sinner and sin cannot exist in the presence of God. So what is the law for? The law is to teach you who you are, take you back to the first Beatitude, work your way through on an ongoing basis. Now, I'll just do the first two. He takes several examples of the law and then he turns them upside down. So after getting through salt and light, he says, now, you are meant to be the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. So neither does a woman light a lamp and then put it under a cover, but on a stand to give light to all who are in the house. So get on with the job. Let the world see what you do. Let the light shine. And he knows the Pharisees are listening, and they don't like, this doesn't sound like their world. And he says, don't think I've come to abolish the law. I haven't. I've come to fulfill it, to show you what it's meant to do and which you have missed. And then he goes on and says, anybody who trashes the Old Testament has lost the way. But anyone who teaches it understands how foundational it is. And then he says this, he says, you have been taught by men of old that you must not commit murder, you must not kill. But I say to you, that's only the beginning. I say to you that if you hate your brother in your heart, you've committed murder. Again and again, God says, I don't look at your actions. I look at your intentions. The most frightening verse in the Sermon on the Mount. There are those who will come to me and say, we did miracles in your name, and I will say, depart from me, I never knew you. Because he looks at the heart. The parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, most people miss, because you hear it in Sunday school. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the foolish man built his house on the sand. Yeah, that's the parable. But most people miss what it's actually about. Jesus introduces it by saying, what I'm looking for is disciples. So how shall I describe a man who hears my word, understands it, says they believe it, but does not do it? They are building on the sand. But the man who hears my word and does it with my help, he's building on the rock. It is actually about doing as the test of whether your faith is real. No fruit, no faith. We, of course, always turn it upside down. We can't get to the fruit on our own. The love that we need is not the love we normally talk about. It's, as Colossians puts it, Paul writes them, say, you're really worth praying for now because you love in the Spirit. In other words, the Spirit is guiding you into love, not as a feeling, but a rational response. Feeling God provides whenever we need it, but it's not something we should focus on. So the fruit of the Spirit is not something we go, without the Spirit we can't get there. So you can see how this way of looking at it both makes it easier and harder at the same time. We are not surprised by failure because we know it's going to be recurrent. In this life, we will never be entirely free. But what we have is a mechanism. When you realize you've really screwed up, you get on your knees, you say you're sorry, and you ask for forgiveness, and it comes, and you're set free. And peace is the result of that process as a regular event. So much for the Sermon on the Mount and killing. Don't kill. He says if you hate your brother, you're committing murder in your heart. He says if you treat somebody in your community as though they're not worthy of your respect, he says it's even worse, because if you kill your brother, you'll be liable to judgment. But if there are people you dismiss because they're beneath you, this is worse. He says you're on your way to hell, because you're going 180 degrees away from the direction Christ wants you to go. So don't look for major crimes. Look around for people you dismiss, and that you have to do something about. Christ did it all the while, and they hated him for it. That's what's meant to happen. He then goes on to, you were taught by men of old not to commit adultery, but I say unto you, if you look on a woman with lust, you've committed adultery. Okay, all men are adulterers at some point in their lives. We're trapped again. He says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. It's pretty drastic stuff. Amazing statements. But it's not the end of the day, because it sends you back to the Beatitudes, and you come through and you can make progress, which is a very nice moment for me to segue into the last wedding in our family, the Saturday before last. This young couple were really fun. They'd only known one another for less than 2 years. He's an Australian. She grew up as a missionary kid in Malawi. And they met at Ontario's Pioneer Camp, an offshoot of IBP's summer camp for kids. And, there was a connection between this Australian family and Pioneer. I've forgotten quite how that worked. But Noah, that's his name, ended up working at Pioneer Camp, and Kalina was working at Pioneer Camp. And after a couple of weeks, Noah came to Kalina and said, I've been watching the way you care for the kids and the way you serve them. I'm very impressed. That's I think, a unique opening to what turned out to be a courtship. Everybody wondered, Noah is a bit of a wild guy. He's an Australian, full of energy. Very different at first sight, but they turn out, I think, to be well matched. The matches God makes see much further than we do. So they ended up very quickly coming to marriage, and a good chunk of the Australian family came across. It was a wonderful marriage. I had a very small part to play, but when they told me what it was, I was impressed. They wanted me to read the lesson for the marriage sermon, which was fine, and Ephesians, and I thought, it'd be a standard practice, Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. That's a standard we can't reach. But it wasn't that passage. They wanted their wedding to reach out to everybody there who didn't really understand. So they chose Ephesians 2. An amazing passage. I was delighted, because Paul in Ephesians 1 is on a rhetorical high. I often say I look forward to meeting the guy who had to write it down. He must have been overwhelmed. But the structure is stunning. It's a 3-part argument about the glory of God and how it works out. But then when you get to Ephesians 2, it's the gospel in a nutshell. He says, but you guys, you screwed up completely. You've lost your way. You really are in deep trouble. And Paul lists the argument, and anybody with any obvious involvement with human life says, we see it all the while. We all do it. So then there's amazing, but God. I mean, the chapter is a stop. There's this disaster, and then but God. When I was reading it, I stopped myself, or I was stopped, I'm not quite sure why. And I read "But God" twice. And several people came up afterwards and said that really stopped me in my tracks when you did that. Because then, "But God, by grace, brings us into his family." It's an amazing phenomenon. And of course, what these two were modeling for the people around them is a way of living which the modern world thinks would be evidence of mental disorder. No sex before marriage. What an amazing start that is. Would that it was more common. Clearly in love with one another. A very laid-back wedding. The guys all wore new jeans and nice shirts. The bridesmaids each chose their own dress, and made their own bouquets. But it was a happy wedding. I've never seen a couple run down the aisle afterwards together to get on with the next bit of life, so to speak. Yeah. The conversations afterwards were, of course, lovely because of that. They chose to use their wedding not for people to see what rules they were going to follow or anything like that, or have any sort of feel-good comments about marriage. They knew the realities. They wanted the people around to realize that they were confident because the "but God" for them, they weren't in the first half of chapter 2. They were in the second, the after. There had been a "but God" moment in their lives, or many of them. That's the way they were going to go. Our world is hungry for it. As I've said before on this podcast, when I'm talking to a liberal audience, I can slip in a note saying, "I don't know much about you," as students in a university I've never been to before, but I do know that you all hate divorce. And body language immediately tightens up. And I say, "Well, hang on a minute. I see you're cross with that. You think I shouldn't say it because it's unkind to divorcees. But I know something about you. I know that you all hate divorce." And of course they do. And the recognition is there. I say, if it hasn't happened to you, it's happened to your friends. And my only question to you is, has any child ever enjoyed it? The answer's no. They may come to see that their parents shouldn't have got married in the first place and it was inevitable, etc., etc. But they've been robbed of something that they're born to have, which is parents who care and love and are caring and loving about one another, and certainly will not consider divorce a child's right. Then I say, a colleague who was teaching in Dallas College at one point. Later on, she moved into other areas, and she has a wonderful talk. Millions of copies are circulating. It's been around for 20 years. She's a single woman, a Catholic woman, who has done the best talk on marriage that I've ever come across, and it's called "Contraception, Why Not?" Just put Janet Smith, "Contraception, Why Not?" into your search engine if this intrigues you, and go see what she has to say. What I say to students is, she's been saying to her students for years, if you keep my 4 rules and you divorce, I'll pay you $1,000. Never paid out. And of course, particularly girls in the audience who normally don't say anything, because I set them up a little bit and say, "Well, that's not tonight's topic, I must move on." And invariably, more than one will say, "What are the rules, please?" So I am asked to tell them how they are to prepare for a secure marriage. And Janet Smith's rules are not the only step, but it's a very good one. 4 things. Practice charity together every year so that the more materialistic one is made better by the less materialistic one. Give away 10% of what God has given to you during the year, at least. That's number 1. Number 2, no sex before marriage. That's the biblical injunction. As a professor in a modern university, so I know that doesn't apply to very many of you now. It's impossible for most of you. So Janet Smith has a very wise piece of advice. She says, if you've had sex before marriage, you did it for subjective reasons and emotional reasons. that's not a good foundation for a marriage. So you should stop having sex together for at least 2 years before you marry, because then you will know that you love one another rather than loving sex. She's right. But what a different world that would produce. Then she goes on and says, when you marry, practice natural family planning, which, by the way, is just as effective. In fact, it's more effective in technical terms than the pill, because you can forget to take the pill. Or if you've got a daughter who's wanting early sex, on occasions I've heard of people whose daughter stole her mother's pills and replaced it with little white pills or little whatever colour they are, pills that look the same, and mom got pregnant. But if you use natural family planning, you know exactly when you get pregnant, because marriage isn't a honeymoon forever, is it? And so you need little times to work on your marriage. You go away for a weekend, and then wife says to husband, you know what time of the month it is? And he knows. That's one of the best things about natural family planning, is that man has to become aware of the rhythms the mother has, his wife copes with. And so he says, you said you weren't ready for a baby. You said we couldn't afford one. And he said, well, I've had a raise, perhaps we could. She said, well, perhaps I'm ready. And you do and you do. And you know exactly when it happened. And you're grateful to God forevermore that it happened. That's the best way to do it. Now, there were plenty of people at that marriage who knew that and had practiced that. It's not an accident that we have 22 grandchildren. It's what happens. And, I mean, the next generation are already underway, so we now have 6 great-grandchildren. And I don't think it will be long, if it's God's will, before Kalina and Noah start their family. That's not a bad thing to do. You can all look back to the times when you had next to nothing, but it didn't matter. When Sally and I got to an apartment we'd bought in London, we didn't have a penny left, and all our goods, we had 2 cars at that point, and we brought everything we possessed in those 2 cars. We slept on the mattress that the guy next door took out of his garage for quite a while on the floor. But we were happy. And we've been blessed along the way. So what other people there could see was true, and they knew it. Most of them were already on side anyway. But the group that I spoke to several times in several different ways, first of all, I was amazed. Several people apparently like this podcast in my extended family and their friends. People I didn't think would enjoy it, but there you go. You know, who am I to say what the good Lord will do? And what bothers me most is the younger generation. What's happening at the moment? I mean, the Trump election is having worldwide ramifications, and hopefully they can be good. In some ways they are. I mean, I knew very early on that DEI, which I prefer to call what it has now done, DIE, I mean, it's dead because it made major mistakes. Lewis said a long while ago that most heresy is getting a good thing in the wrong place. Now, the diversity, inclusion, and equity are good things, as long as the equality is the equality must be equality of opportunity. Otherwise, you kill society because there's no reason to work. So they had forgotten the bigger things, as Paul says, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. There are more important things. But everywhere you look, you see this phenomenon of getting things disordered or not even addressed. If you get in question period with students, they come up straight away with the assumption that social justice as they feel it is what matters most. Now, that's a very silly way to go about things. It's very arrogant for a start. It has no history to it. one has to work on that. I mean, a sportsman would throw them back because it doesn't take long to take DEI apart. But in medicine, where I, up until very recently, until this podcast started, was my main field of activity, I never met a medical student who we started teaching medical ethics around the early 80s. I've never met one who has been taught to look at the ordering of the Georgetown mantra. Your doctor, his ethics will probably consist of simply 4 ideas, which I call the Georgetown mantra: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Being good and doing good, the last 2. And I ask them, okay, that's what you've all been taught. Heads nod. Have you ever been taught that they're ordered? No, never. Which is the most philosophically fundamental of those 4? Never get the right answer. Christians ought to get it immediately, because when God set about for the first time giving us some structure, he allowed a long while of, if you like, following your feelings because they were close to God, but we got lost very quickly. The 10 Commandments, which the liberals reflexly hate, thinking they're cultural constructions, not God-given gifts. They are the 10 divine intolerances. And when you obey them, there's a promise attached: you will flourish, and when you don't, you won't. So the most fundamental things is what God will not tolerate. You can easily rewrite the 10 Commandments as 10 divine intolerances. It sort of makes the point for the modern world. And when those things become so enculturated that you don't even have to think about it, you have a certain sort of society, a Judeo-Christian society. All religious systems and all societies have religious systems. There's nobody out there who's not using faith. Faith is a condition of being human. Those who say, I don't believe anything, well, they believe there's nothing to be believed. That's an act of faith too. You might be wrong. Atheism is an act of faith. It is the belief that there is no God. You can't live without having something that you can't prove. As Lewis put it, if nothing can be assumed, nothing can be proved. So there has to be a solid base. Now, the university, ever since science took off beginning in the 14th century, has moved more and more to what is technically called reductionism. And within 100 years of Newton's death, famously Laplace, a practicing Catholic, said to Napoleon when asked about his science and where God fitted in, Laplace said, I don't need God to do science anymore. But most historians of science are now honest enough to say it is true that the Church was not a perfect patron of science, but it was the only patron of science, particularly experimental science, the science that changed the meaning of the word fact. We'll come back to that, hopefully, in a moment, if I don't forget. If I do forget, there'll be another podcast. But back to those 4 things. So the most fundamental thing is what you will not do. An honourable man is made honourable by what he will not do. That's what the 10 Commandments provide, an appropriate way of not doing things, of being trained not to do the things that are wrong. Now, once you've got that straight in your head, you can easily extrapolate to their opposite, which is the positive good. So, on the foundation of what I will not do, I can build a foundation of what I ought to do. When that is in place, then you've made some real progress, because now you have a framework for justice. A lot of people are now saying, people like Neil Ferguson and others who've come to faith relatively recently from a very intellectual background, they're saying, we need a foundation. I often quote David Stowe, the best philosopher Australia produced, who committed suicide when he got cancer, rationally because he was an atheist. But he also understood that there's no way that using Darwin as the basis of the way you think doesn't give you any grounds for justice or morality. If it really is a fight to the death for benefit to our genes, justice is nonsense. But we all know it isn't. So even in the process of saying, well, I want more justice, we are admitting there's a basis in our life for being able to decide what is justice or what is just or unjust. At the moment, because they go to a university where they're only taught what they have to remember for the next 10 minutes to pass the exam, and otherwise they follow their feelings. That's not education. That's memorize and dump. They never get to what education should really be about. What school was invented for was to make genuine patriots by teaching them history and skills that they needed. So when you've understood there is objective reality underneath the world, you can't explain it any other way, and that there's good and evil, now you have justice as choosing the one and avoiding the other, and you need punishment to push along the line. You cannot overlook wrongdoing. It can be forgiven afterwards for various reasons, but it has to be named and it has to be recognized, and the consequence has to be shown, because there is consequence, and if you pretend there isn't, you get worse consequences. So it's not a good idea to allow it to go untouched. It's got to be treated. Now, I've said many times, and I will go on saying many times, read Left, Duke Law Review 1979, an unbeliever who, like David Stove, but as a lawyer, understands that if you don't believe in transcendence and immanence, you have a very difficult problem on your hands, because who makes the law? And it becomes a battle. And when, for instance, Roe v. Wade was passed, one dissenting justice rightly said, "This is not justice. This is raw judicial power." And he was right. It undermined the law dramatically. Now we're having some pushback. I mean, the Claudine Gay event not so long ago really pushed it home with Harvard, that having DEI as the basis of your choices, affirmative action, means that the people who are affirmed, if they're good, they have to deal with an unjustified smear on their character. But if they're not good, they're in for a very hard time. Tom Sowell points out very clearly, to affirm a smart kid into an Ivy League environment where he is merely virtue signaling, and there's lots of other people like him, and he doesn't have the background that they have, so he fails. He'd be much better off going to his local university, where he would be the best student in the class, and he would get taught with pleasure by those who know more. When you come from that kind of background, you need a longer development period. You're taking off from a much lower base. But we're not actually concerned about the students we're affirming. We just want to virtue signal. That's how badly wrong our society has gone. Now, EI has been trashed by Trump in all government departments. It's going to be interesting to see how this happens. And I gather I may be wrong, and somebody can correct me if I am, but it looks as though the way they're going to get rid of it in the universities is say, well, no government funds if you have DEI in place. You've got to get rid of it. What matters is truth and competence. Those are top of the list in the university. You want to teach what is true, and you must teach how to distinguish good and evil, good truth and falsehood. Most students can't do it. We substitute nonsense. I mean, in medicine, you're always hearing about evidence-based medicine. We were hammered with it in the COVID fiasco. But evidence-based medicine is a pie-in-the-sky idea. I usually say I was once able to do evidence-based medicine for about 0.10 or more zeros, 1% of the literature, because I'd written it. I knew what the methodology could do and what it couldn't do, so I knew when people were washing their data before they presented it, because it worked, but it wasn't very precise, so you had to do a lot of experiments to get a few results. They weren't doing that, though they were deciding the result in advance, which is, I mean, the Obama administration famously said, This is what we're going to do. Now you go and find the evidence for us that it's what needs to be done. That's not the way to go. Because the real pursuit of truth, you end up, oh my goodness, we've got this wrong. That's the paradigm shift idea. When you're honest about it, then things can take off in a way that otherwise they won't. So by saying, get rid of it, now they have to think, okay, what criteria are we going to use? And of course, you're going to come back to competence and truth-telling. And the university can flourish again. But of course, we've done a lot of damage. You listen to someone like Victor Davis Hanson and mourning the loss of the classical curriculum because you see so much about human nature in the Greeks and in the Romans, who were so brutal. I mean, we are so ahistorical. Even Tom Holland, now on the Christian side of the agenda, and who wrote books on history, which made him realize that his childhood love of the Romans, he had no idea how brutal they were. Caesar killed 1 million Gauls and didn't think anything of it. That's what man on his nature is like. We don't teach history anymore. Nobody knows about Hippocrates. We routinely fail at the first fence that they understood. Because if your doctor does not fear judgment after death, given what we're doing in terms of killing patients before they're actually at the end of their lives, that's the exact opposite of what Hippocratic physicians did, because they saw that. Now you go to a place like Africa, the witch doctor can kill you. He's better at that than he is in curing you, because he's very good on poisons. That doesn't produce trust. And the worst thing that's happening to us is trust is dropping catastrophically. If you don't believe me, after you've finished listening to this, take a piece of paper and write down a list of people to whom you could give $10,000 with no paper trail if the People's Republic of Canada decided they were going to take all your money. And you could come back and collect it any time, and you know it would be there. How many people do you trust at that level? And then ask your children to do it. They have even fewer people. It's going down. We are facing a crisis of trust. This wasn't quite where I intended to end, and I'm going to add one tailpiece too. So the students in university are running on the dangerous fuel of their own emotions, especially the girls. And social justice is de rigueur. It's easy to take down. You just read your left and get the argument organized. And they are convinced that the world is not going to last because we have destroyed or are destroying nature, the world. We have a climate catastrophe. There's no good evidence for that. Yes, there are problems, but read someone like Bjorn Lomborg, who's been saying for ages, yes, there's a problem, but it's not the major problem in the world. All the money we've wasted on green projects, if we'd used it to build clean coal generators for Africa, we would have got a net change in CO2, not that it actually mattered that much. It's been much higher in the past, orders of magnitude higher in the distant past. Go and listen to my good friend John Robson's Canadian Climate Nexus, Climate Discussion Nexus. I always get the name wrong. And you can, they've been going for some time now and have lots and lots of followers, but they get people out there who know what they're talking about, and they show you the contradictions. Yeah, we should love it. I live on a farm. I'm concerned about the use of pesticides and the like, that we use them well. On my farm, there are lots of frogs. They're one of the best indicators of an ecology that's getting out of hand. But most of all, to finish this off, I am concerned about young people going into the arts faculty. All I would do is make the arts faculty do what the science faculty does and live by their grants. You get grants, you have a job. You don't get grants, you don't. The university just tops up what you're worth. That would dramatically drop. Any course with studies in it is very unlikely to survive under those circumstances. So when I meet well-intentioned kids who say, well, I want to do something about climate, and they're looking at soft areas, and here's the book of the week. Wendell Berry's Life is a Miracle. I think every young person going into the arts faculty of the university should read that little book. It's quite small. I've got my copy here, as you see, but a lovely book. The best serious essayist now at work in the United States, from an organization called Earth First, so presumably green, but they're all like that. He opens that book. Really, it's an attack on E.O. Wilson, who's basically died from the environment from where this was written in 2000, when E.O. Wilson was still a god. But he makes you think about what matters most. And I'll just finish by reading part of the second chapter, which is called Propriety, which is a good chapter to read today because it's the 200th anniversary of Pride and Prejudice, I think, or close to now, which is a novel entirely dependent for its success on the fact that Elizabeth and all the main characters lived in a world with very distinct ideas of what propriety is, how you should live. Here's what Wendell Berry writes, and this will be the end of today's podcast, so I've annoyed you enough, you can switch off now. Propriety is the antithesis of individualism. To raise the issue of propriety is to deny that any individual's wish is the ultimate measure of the world. The issue presents itself as a set of questions. Where are we? This question applies with as much particularity as human competence will allow to all the world's millions of small localities. It's small localities that are dying out. They were part of my life growing up. The next question, who are we? The proper answer to this question depends on where we are, where we have been, and it includes history. We're not teaching history anymore. What is our condition? This is a practical question. What are our abilities? This is also a practical question. It refers to abilities that are proven, not to abilities that are theoretical or potential, such as aptitude or IQ. Lots of high IQ people don't achieve at all. People with great aptitudes don't have the character to make them work. Next question. What appropriately may we do in our own interest here? And this question submits to the standard of the health of a place. These questions address themselves to all disciplines, but they do not call for specialized answers. They cannot, I think, be answered by specialists, or not at least by specialists in isolation from one another. Wendell Berry elsewhere in this book points out that a professional, as I was, a physicians are people who are largely without place. In other words, given my background as a highly specialized physician, I could function anywhere in the world as long as I had a laboratory and certain techniques available to me. I wasn't dependent upon people there. I was dependent upon things. I didn't have a place in the world. So physicians are often very lonely. They do build, if they stay in the same place for a long while, some set of connections. But professionalism is not a way to strengthen society. And the church needs to learn this too. Paul in 1 Timothy 3 points out that leadership in the church has got nothing to do with skill and everything to do with character. Have a thoughtful week.